Been a few weeks now, and we were here in Hebrews 11, and we began with verse 23. We saw how it focused on Moses' parents. We saw what we termed Moses' parental faith, and Amram, Jochebed, and their faith and their watch care over Moses, but also trusting God by faith, doing what they did. Then we jumped last week into verses 24 through 26, and in that we saw what we entitled Moses' personal faith. Moses' personal faith, and it kind of lays the groundwork for what we'll see tonight. And so, real quickly, we'll just hit on the verses and remind ourselves the highlights, shall we say. But we looked at verse 24, and notice it again. Let's read it by faith. Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We made this observation that reference to Pharaoh's daughter certainly spoke to or referenced the social position that Moses found himself in. So he refused the experience, growing up in it, the experienced social position. And we made the comment that we ought never forget that true faith causes a believer to hold the right values and make the right decisions. When we operate by faith, it enables us, it equips us to make the right decisions and have the right values. Then verse 25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. So number two, not only did he refuse the experienced social position, but number two, he rejected the enjoyable sinful pleasures. He rejected the enjoyable sinful pleasures. We made the observation, just like the season of life, season of sin is fleeting. It will soon end and judgment awaits. And so Moses is a shining example of the reality that it really is a choice between the temporal, fleeting, earthly pleasures and eternal, lasting treasures. And look at verse 26. It would continue, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches, than the treasures in Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. And made some observations. The verse is very much presenting that scale, right? On one side, in the latter half of the verse, we have the innumerable and abundant treasures of Egypt. You couldn't argue with it. We talked about that last week. That was a plethora of treasures that Egypt offered, and probably the most the world has ever seen, or close to it, that nations have possessed. On the other side of the scale, the verse presents to us the reproach, the ridicule, the scorn, the persecution, the suffering, the pain of identifying himself with Israel, and the particular interest, as the verse says, with Christ. He identified with Christ. It would seem like that doesn't make any sense, yet we know what Moses did. The verse says that he esteemed or valued that reproach of living for God by faith as greater riches, more valuable to him. It was what he wanted to cling to than the vast treasures he could enjoy by embracing his social status and living there in Egypt like an Egyptian. And so we came to that last conclusion from verse 26 was this: he rebuffed the extravagant, staggering prosperity. And there's your first blank on the outline, I believe. Okay, that prosperity, he rebuffed it. He turned away from it. He would not have anything. He would not choose that over living for God. And we said that his personal faith in his life presents this truth that we must always keep at the forefront of our minds and hearts as we endeavor to live for our Savior. God's rewards are always greater than the world's. God's rewards are always greater than the world's rewards. Moses understood it, and more importantly, he lived by that truth, and he made decisions and choices based upon the knowledge of that truth. And my friend, if we're going to boil it down, that is living by faith. That's what we see each one of these people did, but Moses certainly did. Now we understand that type of personal faith can't help but have an impact on others. It doesn't just remain private. It isn't something that just, I think of Daniel, I think of other examples throughout the scriptures. It will impact others. This type of personal faith, you're going to have an influence. You're going to have an impact on those around you. It will be on display. You will be in a position to impact others. And what I mean by impacting others, encouraging them too, that this is the way to live life. This is how life ought to be lived. It ought to be lived by faith. I think of George Mueller. I think of others that we could point to and say, wow, they demonstrated a life of faith, which is a challenge and encouragement to us. It is impactful in our own lives. And such is the case with Moses. Look with me at verse 27. We'll read down through verse 30, and we'll only get primarily to verse 27 tonight. But notice what it says. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith He kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea, and as by dry land, which the Egyptians, saying to do, were drowned. Verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. Tonight, here's what we're going to see. We've seen Moses' parental faith, we've seen his personal faith, and now these next few verses we embark upon the journey to understand and consider Moses' public faith. Moses' public faith. If you've ever here been able to have the privilege of visiting the northeastern part of Italy, you may have stumbled across what might be described as a very modest waterway. It's relatively small. In fact, it's quite shallow. It's not very wide. It's shallow too, and it's reasonably unimportant in the grand scheme of things. In fact, it's more of a stream than it is a large river. In fact, the modern Britannica Encyclopedia refers to it as a small stream. Yet this small little waterway, this small little stream came to play a large role in history as it's referenced in one of the many idioms that we have within our English language. The year was likely 49 BC, somewhere close to that at least. Things were rather tumultuous in Italy, though things were great prosperity-wise and economically. Things were going well, and they had they ruled the roost in a sense. That area, even into Gaul, which was modern-day France, they kind of ruled, and they had an impact. So they were doing well that way. But back in Rome, things were somewhat tumultuous. If you know much about the Italian history, the Senate had wielded great power at that time. And yet within that, there were political factions and people vying for power, who would be in charge, and those kinds of things. At the same time, there was quite an ambitious statesman and general within the Roman army. In fact, he was starting to grow in fame, and people back in Rome and Italy were talking much about him. And the Senate, many of the members of the Senate were quite worried. They were starting to get nervous because of the fame and the power that this general seemed to have been growing in. And they didn't want to share power. They didn't want him to become too big. And so he was off in Gaul there, and he had been conquering, had won many battles, been conquering vast territories for Rome, and they were worried over it. So the Senate, the majority standing in opposition to him, they issued a decree or an edict. They notified him that he was to immediately disband his army and he was to return to Rome. In other words, he was being removed from his position, the army was to be no more, and he was supposed to come back to Rome. Well, the problem with that from his standpoint is he lusted for power. He'd gotten a taste for it, and now all the soldiers looked up to him, and many back in Rome and Italy, they were looking up to him. And so this general and statesman, and you and I would know him better as Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, he had a decision to make, and so he decided to bring his entire army back into Italy. He was going to deal as best he could with his political rivals in Rome within the Senate that opposed him. He knew that to do so was going to be an act of rebellion, that this was disobedience to the edict in Rome. In fact, there was a Roman law even at the time that if you brought an army, it was illegal to bring an army into the territory that Rome possessed or ruled, and by penalty of death. And so that was common knowledge. He certainly knew that. And so as he neared that little stream, and as he began to lead his troops over that little stream, it's known as the Rubicon River. As he did so, he understood that he could not turn back. That once he crossed into that, and this was kind of the dividing line between Gaul and the Roman territory at that time, within Italy at least, he understood that he was essentially instigating a civil war. As he did so, it is reported that he issued a single word, or a single statement, He said, "The die is cast." Now, there is supposition or there is opinions as to what he was alluding to. Most likely, he was talking about casting the dice, the die, and throwing it and basically saying, all right, it's out of my hand, it's out of my control, I've already made the choice. You see the statement here. He made the decision once he crossed the Rubicon. He understood that it was a point of no return, that either this would end in him having ultimate power, or this would end in his death, that he would be killed, put to death as a traitor. That was really the only two options, and yet he stepped foot over the Rubicon, he took his soldiers and such. And so today, in our vocabulary, the idiom has become somewhat well known. Crossing the Rubicon. It is a statement that's made that refers to this action by Julius Caesar. It literally means to make a fateful decision from which there is no turning back. To make a fateful decision, a fate-determining decision, a destiny-determining decision from which there is no turning back. It has been widely used and described as this terminology, this idiom or this statement of crossing the Rubicon. It is used to describe critical moments in history, in one's personal life, personal choices with far-reaching consequences. Critical moments in history or personal choices with far-reaching consequences. If you are a history buff, you might remember that this Civil War actually ended up lasting about 5 years. And yet in that time, it really spelled the end of what was known as the Roman Republic at that time. No longer would it be somewhat of a democracy by stretch, at least a republic in that sense. It concluded, the Civil War concluded with Caesar being decreed as Rome's dictator for life. Kind of sounds like the path that Russia's on right now, amen? But anyway. Thankfully, though, Moses was no Julius Caesar. But he did. As we've already seen in the previous verses, Moses faced some of these moments that were what we would call crossing the Rubicon moments. Moments of no turning back. Decisions or choices that were made in his life that kind of determined his fate, his destiny, that he would follow God and whatever God had planned for him. And one of these moments is spoken of here in verse 27, where we just read. By faith, he forsook Egypt. He chose to turn his back on all that we looked at last week and that social status and the pleasures of sin and the reality of the prosperity of the nation of Egypt. And there's no going back from it. There's no turning back. He had crossed the line, if we might put it that way. And let's remind ourselves, the side of Egypt that Moses saw was a picture of the world in its most attractive form. He saw all the glitter. He saw everything that was alluring about the world, the power, the wealth, the prosperity, the social status. He saw it all. This is what Satan used to appeal to him or tried to lure him with and tried to get him to not forsake Egypt over. Yet, though that was the case, we see, as you see it on your outline, letter A, Moses, by faith, he made the decision to forsake the scene. You see, the thrust, or part of the thrust of verse 27 is that he was not enamored by what was seen. He was loyal to what was not seen. The invisible one is verse 27, seeing him who is invisible. And so by faith, he makes the decision to not forsake the unseen, but to forsake the seen. And for that which is not seen, and here's the public influence, right? He led an entire nation to do the same thing. To a land they have not seen, to a place that they have never heard of, to a place that only God has spoken of to their nation 400 years ago, 600 years ago, 800 years ago. He promised their patriarchs, and that's all they know about it. That's all. There were no travel brochures that the Israelites passed around Egypt. There is no pictures from a previous trip that they saw. There is nothing like that. In fact, as far as we know, there is no written account per se. Maybe it was just word of mouth, passed down by tradition among the Jews, the promise among the Jews, the promise of the promised land to their patriarchs. And within this, I find a great picture. In fact, it's there within Scriptures, back in Exodus in the story. It is a great picture for you and I. Forsaking the seen for the unseen, because that's exactly what you and I are called to do on a daily basis. Let's put it into Christian context, shall we? Let's put it into the Christian life, living by faith today in 2024. Let's compare what Moses did with what you and I are called to do. He forsook the seen for the unseen. Well, you and I are supposed to do the same, aren't we? Number one, what are we called to do? Well, we're told not to love this present world. everything that we see, everything that allures us, everything that the devil would use to tempt our flesh, everything that the devil would love to throw before us, like the carrot in front of the rabbit. He allures us, tempts us. He wants us to consume of our own lust. That's his desire. And yet you and I are instructed to not love this present world, to forsake it in our affections, to forsake it in our love. Don't fall in love with this world and all that it offers. That's the instructions. In fact, we know the verse well, right? 1 John chapter number 2 and verse 15 says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. I find that interesting, okay? Don't love the system, and also don't fall in love with what it offers. The things found within it, everything that it allures, everything that's tempting, and certainly Moses experienced that in Egypt. There is much to tempt him with. I think often of young people, and I think of the lure to try to strive to be a great movie star, a great entertainer, a great athlete here on earth. Boy, that can be tempting. That can be, we hold these up as what we would call human idols, and we hold them up in such a way, and those are the things of the world. Can I just tell you, we ought not to love that. We as Christians ought not to fall in love with this world, the things that it offers. Why? Because if any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Those two things cannot cohabitate. They cannot exist together. My love for this place or my love for my Father, my Heavenly Father, and all that He is and all that He wants us to delight in. Those things can't go together. They do not work in the life of a believer. You see, Moses could not choose both to be an Egyptian and experience everything and enjoy everything in Pharaoh's house and also identify with the slaves and experience everything as a Jew. It would not work. In much the same way, God has called you and I to forsake this present world. What does that look like? Don't love it. You can endure it, don't love it. Don't fall in love with this world and all that it offers as much as Satan throws that at us, right? I'm telling you, with the advent of television and the internet, we have faced more temptation to love this world than at any other time, I think. Seems like it's always in front of our eyes, and he's tempting us with something and trying to get us just to lose our love for God or turn our back, forsake our love for God, and embrace love for this world. That love then moves on to something else, doesn't it? Because it played out in Moses' life. Number two, we are not to love this world. Number two, neither are we to set our affections on it, right? Let your affections and values be determined by the principles and convictions that correlate to Christ home above, heaven above. Let your affections and values be determined by the principles and convictions. Again, we have a love letter from home, the Bible, that does not embrace the world's convictions and principles, but rather God's, Christ, those that would be of a heavenly nature. And so the Bible instructs us on the convictions and the principles by which you and I are to live. And so this ought to set our affections. This ought to determine our values. This, God's powerful word, ought to be the thing that instructs us on what we value in our affections. The Bible's pretty clear. I love what Paul wrote the church at Colossae. Always remember context. He's writing to a church, a group of believers. He says, listen, don't get caught up in this world, but rather set your affections on those things which are above. If ye are risen with Christ, that's appropriate coming off Easter. If ye are risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affections, your values, your desires on things above, not on things on the earth. So let your love for God determine your values and affections. Look towards heaven. Work and invest in heaven more than you work and invest here on earth. It is instructive for us. As Moses made his decision, and there's a lot that goes into Moses' decision, his interaction with that Egyptian that he killed and so forth. There's a lot that goes in here. But my friend, he turned his back. He forsook the world. Remember, what is Egypt often a picture of? The world. Moses forsook that. He turned his back on everything that Egypt had to offer, and he said, no, I'm going to identify with Christ. I'm going to set my affections and values on the people of Christ and the people of God and what he desires. Great truth. And then number three, we see this. We must choose to forsake one or the other. And kind of as we've already alluded to, it is impossible to live for both. It's impossible to live for both. You must choose to forsake one or the other. There's nobody in Christianity that can ride the fence. It's just not possible. In fact, Jesus Christ himself said it's not possible, right? Matthew chapter 6 and here verse 24. No man can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and, notice the statement, despise, forsake the other. And I love the picture in that last statement. It's a statement. You cannot serve God and mammon. What would you say is one of the greatest values, affections of this world? Wealth. We would not argue that. It's all around us. We look to what we can do to get ahead. We look at what we can do to make life easier and comfortable on us. And if we don't think we can do it, we ask the government to do it. Amen? And we want somebody else to do it. If they have it, we should have it. And so wealth, possessions, prosperity, we think that that is a measure of what we ought to live for, love, and have affections for. More stuff, possessions, than wealth. And here he says, and so that's why I think Christ himself compared the love of money, mammon, the love of wealth, and serving God. You can't do both. You can't forsake both in a sense. You can't love both. You must love one, forsake the other. And so it is in our Christian lives. We will either love God and go all out for him, living by faith, or we will do the opposite, and we will do it for the things of this world. We will live for self. We will live for the fulfillment of the lust of the flesh and so forth, enjoying what Egypt offers. Paul gives us a great illustration. You remember he had an incident in his life, and he mentioned it to Timothy. Timothy was a pastor in training, and he was probably preparing Timothy for the reality that there'll be people who fall away. There'll be people who say they love Christ and want to follow, and they'll fall out of church, and they'll do things that show that they really aren't serious, or their heart has been stolen away. So he wrote Timothy. In fact, he wrote something to Timothy in chapter 4, verse 10. He referenced a former colleague. He said, "For Demas hath" what? "Forsaken me." And he wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about the call of God, the work, the ministry. He had forsaken that, turned his back on it, and notice the statement, "and hath loved this present world." And then I like this little addition, "and is departed." His heart, something won his heart. Something gained his affections. His values became different than what Paul and other believers and what the scriptures say it should be. And Demas allowed his heart to be affected. And he chose the opposite of Moses. In Moses, we have a great example in Hebrews. Here's somebody who said, you know what, I'll forsake the world. I will set my affections and values on God. I will love the world to come, the life to come, the place that I am a citizen of, more than I love this place that I'm just a passing through. Demas, not so. Demas somehow got enamored by this world. Something happened. Maybe it was a job offer. Maybe a relative said, "Hey, you come work with me. I'll give you a new shiny wooden boat, new shiny chariot. Hey, you come with me, man. I'll make you the wealthiest person of all of Galilee. I'll make you more wealthy than the emperor himself." I don't know what it was. I don't know what lured him, what the devil used. But I'll tell you right now. Somebody caused him to lose his first love, as Revelation would put it. He fell away. He departed. More strongly, he forsook his love for God. The very thing that you and I are called to do, and Moses is a great example for you and I when it comes to the world. We ought not to love this present world. We ought not to allow the world to set our affections and values, but rather those ought to be determined by the principles and convictions that correlate to Christ's home above, to heaven. And then number 3, we must choose to forsake one or the other, for it's impossible to live for both. And what do we know the outcome of someone who tries to live for both? A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Why Christ said no man can serve two masters. You'll be ineffective for both. You'll never accomplish anything. Interestingly, as we look upon verse 27, I find in the study of it, it's actually quite a multifaceted verse. But you know what we see? We see a multiplicity of comparisons and contrast. Look again at verse 27 and notice these, if you will. What do we see? Well, first of all, we see the comparison contrast of fear and faith. You see it there? You can fear earthly kingdoms, earthly kings, or you can have faith in the one who you have not seen, the one who is invisible, God in heaven. So there's a comparison and contrast of fear and faith in Moses' life, and that is true for you and I today. There are things happening within our local government. There are things happening nationally. My friend, I'm just telling you, it's coming. Okay? One of the things, and I'll say more about it in the days ahead, but one of the things our Michigan legislature is trying to do, they're trying to pass some bills. They're trying to do it sneakily. They're going to try to stick it in when people don't notice and quickly before the end of the thing, so that every Christian school and every homeschooler must register with the state. You have to sign your name, you have to sign up and give them details. And in fact, the head of the educational board has said that down the road, not initially, but down the road, they will demand in-home visits for homeschoolers and in-school visits for Christian schools. So it's leading there. Can I just tell you right now, listen, I mean, the handwriting's on the wall. If they will do that with schools within the next few years, they'll do it with churches in the next couple decades. They will. Just see China. We have a letter in our thing where there was one of our supporting missionaries that we support, their church got raided. I'm not going to say their name because this is on the internet and things like that, obviously. But we are just a few short years away from the same kind of government interference in what we're doing. Why? This world is no friend of the follower of Jesus Christ. So don't love it. Don't set your affections on it. But also, don't fear it. Just have faith in your God. Trust Him. Moses is a great example of that. I love the verse because it says, listen, he didn't fear. And we'll learn some things here in a moment. There was much to fear about the Pharaohs. But there's a great contrast and comparison. Fear of an earthly power, faith in the powerful God of heaven. Notice the other comparison contrast. The wrath of that earthly ruler and the pleasing of the invisible one he looked to in heaven. That's within this verse. What's going to move you? What's going to set your affections and values? Is it going to be the wrath of the earthly ruler, or is it going to be the pleasing of the one in heaven who is invisible? Number 3, this one's pretty obvious throughout the whole passage of Moses, about Moses here in Hebrews 11, but it uses the word enduring. It's a great word. We'll get to it in further explanation in a moment. The comparison contrast is, are you going to enjoy Egypt, the world for you and I, or you endure the consequences of forsaking this world? You ever tell somebody you don't do something, and boy, they give you a hard time? I remember as a young person being pressured to drink by coworkers, making fun of me because I wouldn't drink. I remember being teased and ridiculed because I wouldn't curse. I remember being laughed at because I went to church. I went to a Bible college. I remember those things. The world's going to treat you and I that way. If we live for the Lord, if we do things differently, if we forsake the world, the things of this world say, oh, these are fun, these are cool, this is living. It's funny to me how much alcohol and drugs and everything else, they have to tell you that that's real living. Can I just tell you, let you in a little secret? If someone has to convince you it's real living, it probably isn't. If someone has to reason with you, oh, come on, you got to try this, you got to taste this, you got to do this, because this is real. You haven't lived until you've done this. Well, can I tell you, my friend, we know the truth. The Bible's clear. You haven't lived till you met Jesus Christ. That's real living. That's true living. But boy, the world wants you and I to think if we're forsaking those things, if we're not indulging in those things, then we're missing out. We are the ones that, and that's part of the plan. That's what certainly Moses. I can just imagine. There are times that his stepmom, Pharaoh's daughter, came into his room and tried to reason with him. I think there are times that the Pharaoh came and knocked on his door. Moses, we need to have a talk. I think that maybe recorded in Scriptures, the next Pharaoh with whom he interacted when he was to lead the Israelites out into deliverance to the promised land, through the wilderness. I think that Pharaoh probably brought up, do you realize what you turned your back on? Do you realize what you've given up? Moses, all of this could have been yours. You could have been sitting here in this throne. Do you realize everything you've turned your back on? I can just imagine Moses said, oh, I know very well. And I trust and I hope that he would say, and I'm glad I did. And I will continue to do so. It's interesting, the descriptions that are given to us, this employment of the comparisons and contrasts in verse 27, it gives us several things that we can conclude. Some conclusions we can make about Moses and what was going on in his heart, the decisions he made that impacted the entire nation of Israel. Again, this is all out in the public. These things came to the realization of the nation of Israel. Wow, he's left the home of Pharaoh. He's left the kingdom. He's walked away from all of that for us, for his God. It would have had a great impact on the nation of Israel. But notice with me, here are some conclusions. Number one, you see them at the bottom of our outline. Okay, we'll try to get this going. Here we go. The wrath of this earthly king was real, something that could have been very persuasive. When verse 27 says, right after he forsook Egypt, says, not fearing the wrath of the king. There's something to be said for the wrath of this very real leader, powerful ruler, who held the lives of many people in his hands. Who on a whim could kill anybody. We already know that, right? Because all the babies, he already killed. Infanticide. He already killed all the babies, or male babies, trying to ward off the growth of Israel. We've seen that. So this is not somebody to be messed with. And what do you think Moses' flesh would do? I don't know about you, but my flesh would do this. It would tell me to play it safe, amen? Don't make any waves. We like our head attached to our neck. That's what our flesh would say. That's the human side of us, the old sinful nature influenced flesh. We say, well, stop making any wrinkles. Stop making waves. We can ride the fence. We don't have to choose one or the other. We can just kind of go under the radar. Moses, let's just go under the radar. You can serve your God, but do it quietly. Don't make such a big deal about it. Don't have to forsake everything and turn your back on everything of Egypt. And boy, doesn't Satan want you and I as Christians to go under the radar? Under the radar. Don't affect people at work. Don't impact. Don't influence them. Don't your family. Just keep religion out of the topic and out of the conversation. Don't talk about those things. And let's just go under the radar. Can I just tell you right now, there ain't ever a time in the Scriptures that God says you and I should be Christians that are under the radar. We're to be lighthouses. We're to be salt. We are to impact and influence wherever we are. We are to leave a good savor for our Lord Jesus Christ. That's the challenge. But you can be sure, boy, Moses' flesh said, don't do that. We are well aware that Pharaoh's wrath was rightly to be feared. It was real. It was something that was very tangible. On two different occasions, two different pharaohs either threatened Moses' life or they came after his life. You remember this? After word had spread that he had killed an Egyptian in defense of a Jew who was being persecuted. This is what we read in Exodus 2:15. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. You're dead, buddy. Egypt's most wanted. For those of us who are old enough, Moses' picture was in at the post office or on the side of a milk carton. Anyway, wanted dead or alive. That's what he was. Sought to slay him. Moses fled, right, from the face of Pharaoh. It was to be feared. He was a powerful man. You didn't cross Pharaoh, and yet he chose to do so. The decided purpose. Then there was 40 years later, right? 40 years later, a different Pharaoh. He had been in and out. He had gone there. He made the audacious claim to go into this Pharaoh's throne room and say, listen, my God says, let my people go. And through several interactions with this Pharaoh that resulted in the 10 plagues and so forth, that play out at one point in this interaction. You remember what that Pharaoh, a different Pharaoh, but no less powerful, you know what he said to Moses? Here's what he said. They had an interaction, a conversation, and he says this, and Pharaoh said unto him, get thee from me. Get out of my face, in modern vernacular, right? Get thee from me, take heed unto thyself, see my face no more. For in that day that thou seest my face, thou shalt die. Now, I've had one of my boys and talking about Nerf guns or saying, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to kill you, okay? I don't take that threat literally. But if the Pharaoh of Egypt said, listen, you're going to die next time I see you, I would take that seriously. I'm going to take that seriously. A powerful man. He could do whatever he chooses, whatever he desires. He looks at Moses and says, I'm going to kill you. If I ever see you again, if you ever see my face, you are a dead turkey. Pretty powerful. You take that threat, that ought to be feared. And then I think of his grandfather, Pharaoh, the one who likely sought to kill him and so forth. Could you imagine how enraged he would have been at the ingratitude, the perceived ingratitude of Moses? The audacity of this Jewish pup that was plucked from the world, was given the greatest and the best things that Egypt had to offer, and he spurned it all. And Moses, you spurned it for a God you cannot see? Look around you. The gods of Egypt are all here. The sun god, the river god, and all the idols and so forth. At least they're tangible. At least you can see them. But your God, Moses, your God that you have turned your back on Egypt for, is an invisible God. And think of it. Think of it from this perspective. During that time period, it was well believed that the Pharaoh was the incarnation of their chief god, Ra. That he was the human manifestation. He was the incarnation of God. And don't you think that the devil would come along and say, Moses, that could be you on the throne of Egypt someday. You could be a god of Egypt. Don't you think that Satan tempted him with those thoughts? I'll guarantee you he did. You say, how do you guarantee? Here's how I guarantee. You realize that even to today, the devil is tempting you and I to be a god in this world? A determiner, a master of our own destiny. You be your own God. You as the creation, you act like the creator. You be a God unto yourself. You determine everything. Don't listen to the God of heaven. Don't listen. It's the same ploy he used in the Garden of Eden. God's lied to you. God hasn't told you all the truth. You be your own God. You make your own choices. You determine your own destiny. Can I just remind you, there's only one who is sovereign and omnipotent. He is the God of heaven. You and I are not. But you can be assured, the devil came along and tempted him with that thought, with that statement. You could be the God of Egypt. But instead, he chooses to please the invisible God of heaven, to suffer the wrath of an earthly king. So you know what we conclude? Number 2, here's what we conclude. Moses' view of the invisible God was greater than his vision of the powerful earthly ruler in front of him. I like that. His view of the invisible God. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense unless you're looking at it through the eyes of faith. His view of the invisible God was greater than the vision of the earthly power standing in front of him. I love it. Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those guys, they said the same thing, right? Listen, God's more powerful. You may throw us in the fiery furnace. His 3 friends. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. You may throw us in the fiery furnace, but we're not going to bow to you. My friend, you know what God needs today? Is a bunch of Christians that won't bow to this world, but will only bow the knee to Jesus Christ. Love not this present world. Allow your affections and your values to be set by the convictions and principles that correlate to God's home, to heaven. And then, my friend, I would encourage you and I that we ensure that we too are like Moses, that we aren't convinced by the things that this world has to throw at us and so forth. Choose to forsake this world so that we can fully serve our God.